So thank you for inviting me. There's a lot happening, isn't there? There's a lot happening here in Scotland. It's great, absolutely great. And as Kenny said, I mean, you mentioned about council tax exemption. We thought we were doing well on that because we left it to individual councils in England, local authorities, and there's about a third have taken that on. But that means 2/3 haven't. So when I heard that announced that across the board, all authorities, or 32 is it? 32 authorities were going to be able to exempt from council tax. That's absolutely great. By chance, I'm actually at a meeting on Monday which involves the Children's Minister from England. So I'm going to ask him if he's going to follow Scotland's example and exempt all care leavers in England. And I'll see what response I get on Monday. So, that's good news. I'm going to explore two questions. Why do some young people from care do well in adulthood? And what are the challenges facing corporate parents in helping more young people to do well? And I'll be drawing on research from the UK, countries of the UK, international research, and I think there are two particular very important studies. One from Chicago, which has followed up young people from care in different American states up to about 29 years of age now. So it's quite a substantial information data. And a very large Swedish study. When I say large, it's entire birth cohorts that compare care leavers with the general population with the general population of young people. 10 birth cohorts, and they've followed them right up into late age, I should say. I mean, up to 60, 70 now. It's developing all the time. So it's a massive data set. And at the end, the references. So they're two very significant studies. But there are lots of other studies. One that my colleague, Joe Dixon, led on, that I was involved in on corporate parenting in England. And the method we used for that was to use peer researchers, young people from care, who did all our interviews. I mean, it's a complex process, involves training, support, young people who are able to make sense of their lives to support other young people. But it was a very successful project. Some of you may know Joe's name because Joe and I did the original research in Scotland in 2000, the very first national study of leaving care in Scotland in 2000, and we worked together on that. So she's still at it as well, she's keeping going. There's recurring evidence from international studies that doing well in adulthood is associated with 4 very important factors. And these are very predictive. Not totally. Nothing's totally predictive when we're working with young people, as everybody in this room knows. But they set a very strong context. That's having stability in care, doing well at school, and very interestingly, Scandinavian countries particularly place far more emphasis on education and how you address deficits, I'll come on to that, than probably the UK and some other countries. Leaving care later, hence the developments around continuing care, as you're calling it now, in the new Act, and being supported into adulthood. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence now that those 4 areas provide a context for understanding and promoting the resilience of young people, which I think is an important idea, resilience, bouncing back from adversity, which many care leavers have experienced, as you know, and the agency of young people. In other words, how young people and when young people are able to participate, agency is an absolutely critical concept. But it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has to be promoted. And I'll be talking a bit about that as well. And of course, the converse of all these factors are risk factors. So young people who move around the care system a lot, who drop out of school or do very poorly, who leave care at 16 or 17 or younger sometimes, and who receive very little support, they generally have by far the poorest outcomes into adulthood. And obviously, there's groups who have mixed risk and success factors as well. So why does stability matter? Why does it matter? I think it was touched on with your cat story at the beginning about a secure base you mentioned. It does provide young people with compensatory attachments when it works well. and continuity in their lives. They may not be quite the same thing, because I think you can talk about attachments where young people are going to remain in care of. Continuity, maybe for older young people, teenagers who come in late, may be equally as important. And in a sense, I suppose young people shouldn't be sacrificed at the high altar of attachment theory if you can achieve stability and continuity later in their lives. And there's quite a lot of evidence that young people who come into care later, where they have an opportunity of continuity rather than continual movement, then that can be very compensatory for young people. She was always there for me. I could talk about my problems. She listens to you. I was loved. Love is often something that's been lacking or been distorted in young people's lives before they come to be looked after. So I think I was loved is a powerful comment. We also know that attachment and continuity are the foundations of healthy psychological development, which is very important, which includes good mental health and well-being. And also, which again we don't hear as much about, a concept developed from the States quite a bit, emerging adulthood, recognising that we shouldn't get siloed all the time about young child development, but recognise the challenges of working and engaging young people into adulthood. We have a new social work act, so we're not quite as behind, and that now all young people will be supported in England up to 25 years of age. 25 years of age. And that's similar in Scotland, isn't it now? Yeah, 25 years of age. Well, this is certainly emerging adulthood, isn't it? This is certainly an engagement and understanding what's happening in adulthood and the relationship between children's and adult services. I mean, children's services traditionally have been linked to the legal age of majority, 18, but now we're talking about up to 25. It opens up massive challenges around those relationships as services, as corporate parenting. And also, of course, attachment and continuity are a basis of individual agency, of young people being able to participate fully in their lives. So what are some of the challenges around stability? I didn't know what was going on in my head because I was moving around so much. You people in this room will know very much about the impact of moving. Where we have the data on placement instability across a whole career from entry to care, it tends to show three groups of people. You don't have this data in Scotland because I've been involved in an email exchange with Scottish Statistics, and I mentioned about did they collect this data because I wanted to explore it, compare it with England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and they don't, but they're going to be piloting it in the new year, so that is something perhaps to follow up with the Care Commission, the importance. They were very open, very receptive. What you have in Scotland is data for the number of placements in the last year. Well, that doesn't tell you very much, does it? Number of placements in the last year about stability and instability patterns. I mean, you'll know if it's bad if someone has had 4 negative moves in the last year. But across the care career, it's a very telling and important information to have. So about 10 to 15% of young people have 10 plus placements, about a third have between 5 and 9, and about 45% up to 4 placements. So clearly, there are challenges about reducing major moves that are negative moves. I always make that point. Not all moves in care are negative moves, some can be very positive, so it's important to have a qualitative dimension. But we do know that such disruption, when we're looking at those who have 4 plus particularly, has an impact on personal relationships, on trusting, on forming attachments. And young people become increasingly detached from education, from locality by moving around. And that contributes psychologically to what we know is fragmented identity. In other words, a lot of stress for young people being able to put their lives together. And detachment patterns contribute to young people leaving care early. So that, I mean, when I started this research in the early 80s, a lot of young people wanted to get out of care as soon as they could. They'd had negative experiences, they'd often moved around a lot, not all obviously. And what became clear was they were increasingly become detached from anything meaningful to them. So leaving care, getting out the first thing was a positive note for them. I need to do this. You know, it's been such a negative. Increasingly, we've seen in our studies and other studies young people becoming more settled in care, having good attachment, and therefore the opportunity that you've mentioned with continuing care and staying put for young people wanting, and increasing numbers we talk to now want to, corporate parenting study 2015, want to they feel they're leaving care too early, a lot of them now, whereas 20 years ago or so that wasn't the case. And that's a credit, in a way, to improvements in the quality of care where young people want to stay put as well. So what can we do about it? That's a question. What's some of the areas where we can improve stability that come out of the studies? Well, the first is having systematic data on placement patterns at local council level, local authority level, and Scottish Government level. We need to understand what's actually happening. Entry to care, movements in out of care, movements leaving care. So strategically, the word strategically has already been mentioned, strategically we can look at where breakdowns are occurring, the patterns occur. What's happening? Is it in residential care? Is it foster? Is it when young people go back home, come back into care? And see what those patterns are. I mean, you're entitled, working with young people in difficult circumstances who are very challenging, you're entitled to know, to have that information to help you improve the stability of young people. It's very important. Having placement choices to meet the variety of needs of young people and the wishes of the care population, whether that's kinship care, foster residential care, increasingly the importance of specialist care placements, high support placements, as we're aware of. And home supervision, of course, in Scotland is an important resource. I'll talk more about that a bit later. We know about the importance of providing permanence of the young people remaining care, leaving care. But I suppose the strongest message that's come out of the international studies is placing the greatest emphasis on the quality of placements that young people have. The quality of placements. And we don't do a lot of work around quality. I was involved in an overview for the English government called Quality Matters a few years ago. And it was interesting, if you ask people about quality, how do you decide whether that foster placement or that residential placement is a good placement? Oh, we know she's good, she's great, you know. Or we know that children's home, it's lovely, you know, the kids are there, happy there, they're doing all right, all that kind of stuff. But there's very little methodology around quality of care. Of course, the important thing, this is central to the rationale of this and the covenant, this event in the covenant, of course, is having systems that take the views of young people and those who care for them. The social workers, the leaving care workers, the residential and foster carers, and having a model to assess quality. And that would link to the first point about data. If there's lots of breakdowns in certain areas, then understanding what is happening is very, very important. So developing models of quality in commissioning and quality assurance. So meeting individual needs. We like to treat all our young people as individuals. This, for example, is individual number 16976. I have to say, in case there's any misunderstanding, this is not a typical Scottish social worker here. Cartoons done by a young person from care in England who became a professional cartoonist and now works for national media. So quite important, old Fran. So I said that stability is also associated with mental health, which is absolutely critical. An issue that's become higher profile, I think probably in Scotland as well as England, hasn't it? Become quite high profile, not before time. I hate being like I am, I don't care about myself. So the studies we have, research studies and ONS data, shows that roughly between 40 and 50% of young people who are looked after at some time have a psychiatric disorder. And that includes the ONS data on Scotland. They were included in this data set. And the most recent study, I think, was by Bernardo, shows up to like 46%. Now, some of these studies do use different definitions. Some use mental health under mental health legislation, which includes like depression, conduct disorders, anxiety disorders, psychosis. Others use more general well-being. So there isn't a consistency around that. It's also true that many young people enter care, given their maltreatment and neglecting families, with quite severe mental health problems, and that care can lessen and improve these. So these tend to be static data. And there is some evidence that care can do very well in improving the well-being of young people in good quality placements. But that's part of the challenge if young people are entering care with major problems. It's what we can do about it. The Office of National Statistics data, which is a pretty large data set, which compared young people in private households with young people who were looked after, identified some of the care variables. What is it then that's contributed to young people looked after having higher levels of mental health? And the areas they identified were interesting. Residential care. Well, residential care gets very bad press. It's often demonised, and yet when people who look at, if you look at residential care, as many of you will know, that young people generally who end in residential care have experienced multiple placements. They're broken down in often foster care or home supervision on many occasions. They often fall into that group I mentioned with very high numbers of placements. And there is evidence that some young people can settle in residential care and do very well. But taking the start data, it is a kind of a risk factor. Instability, well, I mentioned that, I don't need to go on about that. Interestingly enough, late entry to care is associated with increasing mental health difficulties. And that's an interesting research, because what it shows is that often young people are coming into care when their problems have escalated to such a high level that care becomes a last resort rather than a positive choice of intervention. And those young people then, it requires a lot of skill, work, effort, love, help to work with those young people. So coming into care later with the escalation of problems contributes to high levels of mental health. And at the time of leaving care is a particular time where problems may increase. So care leavers in our corporate parenting research, age 16 plus, were twice as likely to have mental health problems than 13 to 15-year-olds. And there is evidence that it can double on leaving. Now, transition is a difficult time for all young people. Leaving home, going off to college, whatever, all those things are difficult anyway. Time of joy, excitement, but also can be great difficulty. And it can be a very stressful time. And when I looked at the studies in a bit more detail, then it was clear that the group who experienced the most difficulties were those who leave care the youngest, 16 or 17. Now, when I looked at the comparative data for the United Kingdom of age of leaving care, then in Scotland, young people leave care the youngest. The average age is something like 17. In Northern Ireland, they leave care the latest, they're moving up to 20, 21. England, around 19, 18, 19. So there are challenges in Scotland about the age of leaving care, increasing that. And I thought I'd look back at the study we did, it was published in 2006 in Scotland, to see then the average age of leaving care was 16, and now 2016, I think it's 17. So the developments that you have in your covenant about continuing care, staying put, those areas, will be very critical. Because in Northern Ireland, you would say, where young people are leaving 2021, it's very closely associated with their scheme. Theirs is called Going the Extra Mile, their particular staying put scheme is called Going the Extra Mile. So that can make a significant contribution, but there are problems as well. The Bernardo study found that 2/3 of young people, of their 46%, were not receiving any statutory service with mental health. That was in England. That was an English-based study. So, what can we do about it? What are the messages from the research for policy and practice of corporate parenting? Oxford have done a review just quite recently. Some of you may have seen it, a mental health review. And, I mean, the things that come out may not surprise you, but again, stability, and for most young people, providing good quality placement, that does the trick for most young people. Stability and good quality care. For a far smaller percentage, then, it's very important that problems are addressed early, that they have good quality mental health assessments. Now, what is being proposed in England is they have assessments on entry to care. I've argued against just doing that. I'm saying that when young people first come in touch with social work departments and there are problems around mental health and well-being, that's when the first assessment should be. It should be a pre-care assessment to find out where young people, where the problems are. And then continue it, obviously, entry, possibly post-care if necessary. But it's never too early. Problems are arising to have a good quality assessment. So that's quite important. Then there are issues of access to mental health treatment. As I say, I'm placing this in the context of quality of care, because for most young people, fine. But around 10 to 15%, sometimes more, then mental health treatment is very important. And that raises issues, which has been a long-standing issue in England, but I don't know about Scotland, about access to CAMHS. Is that problematic in Scotland? Yes. Is it problematic across 32 authorities or just some? Is it? Yeah, right. Okay. Well, in England it's a little bit more hit and miss, but it's a massive issue because I can give you some very good examples where it can work well. Now, Tam Bailey, who I worked with, we did one of the Scottish studies. Can't see him, he's around Tam. But I remember in the Glasgow, in the SIP, remember the days of SIPs? Social Inclusion Partnerships, I'm showing my age now, that was in Scotland, the SIPs. I remember that in the Glasgow Leaving Care team, there were mental health workers, worked who came regularly to the team. They were there, co-location. They were on site. So there was none of this referral. 3 months later, you get a phone call, all right, we'll see, They were part of that team. That model was developed in part, not everywhere in England, some authorities have adopted that, co-location. So the CAMHS workers, say, go every Thursday, say, or maybe Wednesday or Thursday. And they do two things. They work with the staff to help them work with the young people. So if they're going to do, say, help them with maybe behaviourist program, or something more dynamic or psychological, they help the workers, that's one. And the second thing is they would work then with some very, very damaged young people who've had particularly very, very damaging experiences and work directly with them. But that's dependent on access, solving the access issue. And it's a big issue in England. It's a big issue, young people missing out, and of course they don't complain. They get more depressed, more anxious, and it affects their whole lives. It's an appalling state of affairs. So again, for the care review in Scotland, I don't know whether these things are relevant, but that's an issue probably worth exploring, the relationship with CAMHS. And then there's another key issue that particularly relates to care leavers, which is access to adult services during transition. Now, what I've called this, there's a clinical gap. There's a clinical gap. And the gap is between well-being and mental health. So that where you do get access to CAMHS, if you're one of the fortunate people that's won the lottery that week and you get access to CAMHS, then they often are helping people with general well-being. That's very important. Some they're helping with a lot more serious problems, general well-being. But adult mental health services, in England anyway, you have to have a clinical diagnosis under mental health legislation to access those services. So there's a big gap. And how that's addressed is absolutely critical. One would be possibly extending CAM services into adulthood. One would be to say, right, corporate parents, we're supporting young people up to 25. So why is CAMS only up to 18? Why adult services sometimes 21? You know, looking at the inconsistencies within the age gates, the gatekeeping age process. If corporate parenting, one thing, we've got to be consistent. We all know that we all get blamed as parents for being inconsistent, don't we? And we've all been inconsistent. But how do you tackle that? But this inconsistency has major issues for young people's mental health, young adults. That idea of emerging adult is absolutely critical. So again, that's maybe something for the care review to think about whether there can be consistency in those ages. Why does school matter? The third area, the second area on this. I'm angry at folk for not pushing it at school. It's very interesting this, having done some work in Scandinavia, or still doing some work in Scandinavia, where these Swedish studies, these 10 entire birth cohorts comparing young people in the population with care leavers, they're a massive predictor of doing well in adulthood in terms of mental health, employment, personal relationships, keeping out of trouble, prison, all that stuff. Massive, 4 or 5 or 6 times it's associated with doing well at school. I'm talking at school at the moment, at school, doing well at school. So this is the big deal in Scandinavia. If you get young people to be engaged at school and do well, maximise what they're doing, then you're well on the way to helping them into adulthood. They're confident when they look at this research. In big data set, we're going to work massive numbers of kids and all that. So I thought, well, let's look at this in a bit more detail. What's it about? Well, we know it's about the obvious. If you do well at school, then you're more likely to go on to have a choice of where you want to go further, higher education, employment, career. Also, the Swedish study about future well-being. But when I looked at it also, and looked at some of the other research on this, then there's an area that's very downplayed, which is about what it also gives young people is new opportunities, friends, leisure activities outside of care, outside of care. It's a kind of, and I thought, well, that could be significant. That could be significant, not just doing well at school, I mean, that's important in Swedish. So again, looking a bit more theoretically at that, and looking at social identity theory, what helps people kind of feel good about themselves and not good about themselves, and what does that mean? Then I think if you add those two things together, doing well at school, or maybe not doing so well to begin with, but having the new opportunities, friends, all different forms of leisure, then it gives young people what you could say a normative leap from a care identity, if you like, to a common identity. Not in a way of denying care, but a way of positively moving on in a way of ordinary activities, whether that be leisure, music. There's so much. I was looking at some of the Scottish stuff on creativity, that what do they call it, the Life Something Trust, that fund and other groups. The creative agenda, absolutely critical. The creative agenda, absolutely critical. And schools and education open up a lot of those doors. So in a way, the Scandinavians might be right to place quite a bit of emphasis, or more emphasis on education. And it gives a chance probably to destigmatise negative care experiences. So that if you all know it, I mean, through hobbies, leisure interests, things like that, things that work for you, you immediately move on, don't you? Whether that be music, arts, cultural, supporting Celtic, or other good football teams like that. It gives you something, doesn't it? It's the only good football team in Scotland at the moment, isn't it? Celtic. Yes? Managed by a Welshman. But the point I'm making is making that leap psychologically is the big deal. So the education agenda is quite an important one. The challenges are great. I think I'm special because I tried and finished college. We found in our corporate parenthood study, Joe and I, that young people very much value doing well in their education. It meant a lot to them. Again, if we went back to our early studies, that probably wasn't the case. One or two did, but the majority, school was something you bumped off from and so whatever. It wasn't the deal. But now it's very important to young people. Again, a credit to those who work with young people for raising expectation and aspiration. But it does matter. It does matter to young people. Now, this raises some problematic issues to think about. We know there's an attainment gap at all levels, and a high percentage of young people also with special educational needs within the education system. There's also, I looked at the Scottish data, in the last, I can't remember since the day, 10 years or so, there's evidence of progress. There's progress. But there's still significant gaps with the general population, because the general population are moving forward as well. So the gaps haven't reduced that much, but there is definitely some progress. In Scotland, the gaps with the general population were something like 46% in leaver attainment, 20% in leaver destination. This is the 2015-16 data from your statistical office, which I've got. And the achievement levels were interesting. The lowest groups were looked after at home. Looked after at home. You don't hear a lot about that group. There's a PhD student, John Paul, who's done work at Strathclyde, which I examined. I don't know whether John Paul's here or not, but no. But there were small scale samples, so nothing. But it was depressing. It was depressing reading. And the first thing when I read it that struck me was, why aren't these young people being in care? They'll do better. Now, I'm sure that's not the case across the whole of Scotland, but there is a case for more systematic research into that particular group of young people. We also know that young people are far less likely to go on to higher education. It's something like 7 times less likely than the general population in Scotland at the moment. I think you'll probably find, as we do in England, there are variations between local authorities. But it's not an easy issue, this, because as care is more successful at keeping people out who shouldn't be there, then you're focusing on more vulnerable young people, and education, becomes more challenging. There's all those issues. And they're more likely to be neat. In our corporate parenting study, none of the young people who were not in education had achieved 5 A C, that's English standards, and the early patterns of truancy and exclusion. So, it's very important. I felt for years trying to get my head around all this stuff on education. And you've got kind of 2 directions. One is normative. You keep plugging away at normative expectations of the general population. Well, there's three possibilities. 2, should you compare young people in care with those not in care who've got similar backgrounds? Or 3, should you look at the progress young people make from entry to care? Or should you have some way, you should never abandon normative expectations because they raise aspirations. But when young people come into care, 14, 15 years of age, from family backgrounds where they've missed out massively at school, the foster care's got them settled for the first time, some love and attention, and they're beginning to settle down in school. They're not going to tick any boxes on any Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, Wales, anywhere. But they're making progress, So how we measure, how we make sense of this. What the Oxford Review showed, along those lines in a way, is that there are 2 big pre-care aspects to why young people do poorly at school from care. And one is structural disadvantages. You cannot remove the care population from their structural and social background. The inequalities around area, locality, class, gender, ethnicity, and other related dynamics. You can't do that. And the second is the pre-care experiences you have in their own families and the degree and extent of maltreatment and neglect they've had before they come into care. And I think there are other dimensions, like the age of coming into care as well. Now, those things cast a very long shadow and mean that many young people come into care with very, very poor starting points on entry to care. But where they're at is very low down. So the challenge is great. So to write off them and their carers, because you're doing both things, as not achieving normative outcomes, would seem quite a harsh thing to do. So, what does work and what should we be doing? Well, the things that do work, those that do well, have the things I mentioned. So you've got recurring themes here: stability, continuity, leaving care later. The Scottish data identified 3 factors about the best educational outcomes. Being in foster care, having few placements in a year, that doesn't mean a lot to me, but it's better than having a lot. And in the whole year, but those 2 factors come out. But there are some very other important developments that can help young people progress. So I've actually shifted the narrative to progress now from normative outcomes, but I'll come back to that in a minute. There's a lot of work gone into catch-up learning programs. The work that psychologists have done in Canada, for example, on looked after children, shows that maltreatment and neglect affects greatly cognitive abilities. Affects the cognitive ability, particularly around literacy and numeracy. Probably the other way around in terms of degree of effect, numeracy and literacy. And it's very interesting that when you look at data that excludes English and maths from attainment, care leaders can do remarkably well. But when you include English and maths, and particularly maths, it drops dramatically. So do we accept, which is interesting, because some of those subjects aren't far away from English and maths that young people do. So in Canada, Scandinavian countries, one or two areas, and now in England and I'm sure in Scotland, there's emphasis on detailed or comprehensive catch-up programs addressing cognitive deficits. Now this isn't just how did you get on at school today, going to the parent, the things we thought in the 80s and 90s was enough, that love was enough, helps a great deal. These are programs that are being developed to address those deficits that social work and teachers, schools, and educational psychologists help work together to develop programs. And the ideal is, again, like I mentioned about mental health assessments, the ideal is when young people are first in touch with social work departments. That's the ideal time, because if they've experienced or are experiencing maltreatment and neglect, it's very important that the intervention ideally starts then. If the maltreatment is so great, obviously they'll end up being looked after, coming into care. And again, that's when the programs of addressing catch-up learning programs should kind of begin. There are other areas that help progress, preventing truancy and exclusions, and again, raising expectations, motivation, and aspirations. I know there's a lot of work done on that in Scotland, isn't there? A lot I've read about, in fact. But maybe some of these other areas are important as well. So what else should be done? What else have the Scandinavians and others looked at? Well, the quality of education itself is an important issue. So if young people in poor areas with poor schools, then that obviously has an effect. And Nicola gets a bit upset when she gets interrogated about education, which you're the leader, about Scottish education, because there is some evidence that whereas at the top of the tree it's been struggling. But that has an impact, that young people go to schools, and where they go to school and those schools, they matter, as do the school and social work links. So that's important. Now, there are some other ways of thinking about this. If you want to combine a normative narrative through the Scottish data, which compares young people with the general population, we need that, so there's a problem about that. But if you want to rebalance that with a progress narrative, and in other words, how young people do from entry to care, we don't collect that. We don't collect that in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We don't have progress measures. Some countries in the world have progress measures. Yeah, they look at how young people, where they start, and they do that. But we don't in the 4 countries of the UK, because I think there's a fear that that would reduce expectations. I don't think it would, because the data would be there, you expect the data. But you need a good way of measuring progress. There are ways of doing it. I'm working with a Leaving Care project in Leeds, which we use a measure called Outcome Star, an individual measure of how progress was. But there are more sophisticated ones than that look at education. But if you think, recognise the importance of progress, which I think there are good arguments to do, then you should really begin to think about how you talk about failure. So should, for young people who've got lots of deficits and who are moving in the right direction, that foster care has engaged that 15-year-old for the first time, got them to trust, got them to go back to school, got them interested in the world, having been completely in their own world. They've come out because of they've been so contained by their own misery, and the foster care has begun to engage them, and the residential work has been able to kind of form a very good relationship with them. Then should we begin to think about education attainment 16 as a delay, not a failure? Should we recast that debate to recognise maybe that people can make progress? And the other thing that's interesting on this is that there is research that Zachary Duncalf did in Scotland that looked at attainment of care leavers up to 70, I think it was, sample, and shows that attainment increases with age. So when young people, maybe fall in love, go back to learning, continue education, their lives have settled a bit, made more sense of it, then they catch up later. And that's another argument, I think, to think about how we balance normative and progress narratives around care and leaving care. Right, I shall crack on. So why does leaving care later matter? This was from our first Scottish study. I was only 16 and still a bairn, and get a bit weepy at times. A young woman in our first Scottish study who was living on her own, desperate, sad. Very, 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 very sad circumstances. We know that leaving care later is associated with more gradual transitions from care, and we know from theoretical perspectives around transitions that the way that most young people in the general population cope is that they don't have all major life changes in a very short time. Their journey to adulthood is often extended, hence I got white hair, had a sudden kind of non-linear, that was his journey as well. He fits all these actually. Supported, too well supported, be in my pocket, another one. But that often contrasts with the instant adulthood, or what's called accelerated and compressed transitions of many young people in care. They're having to cope with lots of changes in a very, very short time. So, again, looking at it in a bit more depth, we know that leaving care young is at odds with normative, cultural, and increasingly, for the recent work, neurobiological development, where the brain development now is up to about 27 years of age. So any positive experiences during that time are very important, whereas instant adulthood is very negative. So there's very strong arguments on those three levels for continuing care and staying put, those areas. The challenge is most young people leave care 16 and 18, so blah, 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 blah. That's okay. The positive trend is the stopping with former foster carers. That's very important. Stopping on is a very positive trend. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a second. We know in the general population, including Scotland, about half of 20 to 24-year-olds and 20% 25-year-olds live with a parent. But in our corporate parenting study, about a third felt they had no choice about leaving care. They wanted to stop on. They wanted to remain in care, either residential care or close, or with their foster carers. They wanted to remain. Again, that's a change over time that we would have had. And they felt they had no choice about leaving care. and it opens up wider issues about council funding and priority for this group, which might be another thing for the Care Commission. I think I ought to write to this Care Commission. It might be another thing, because I think that if you've got the data on the long-term outcomes being so poor, then it's short-sighted not to fund extended placements, negative outcomes, you know. So I think there are some good arguments. The economics of it make sense. And also we know that those who leave care young have a cluster of problems. They're the highest, most vulnerable group amongst the care leavers population, those of either 15 or 16, or 17 years of age. They have a cluster, usually unstable patterns, homelessness, getting into trouble and all that. They're the most vulnerable group by a long way, that group who leave care young. Right, so staying put, this is what we're all on to now, staying put and continuing care. The evaluations we have show that young people who stay put, these are English evaluations, twice as likely to be in full-time education, more likely to be in training employment, less likely to be neat, more likely to have gradual and supported transitions, building on attachments, less likely to experience housing incidents. But, and this is the challenge for staying put and continuing care. Those examples, the evaluations from England and Northern Ireland, show that they don't include the most vulnerable young people. This is a challenge. It's a kind of queen. They don't include generally late entrants to care, those from residential care, those with unstable backgrounds, unemployment and problems. So the challenge of extending staying put now, Kenny's written it in his article, I think you've given a copy out, haven't you, in the packs, I think there's a pack of it, about how you implement these things. The entitlement to continuing care to 21 in Scotland is great, because it includes foster, kinship, residential care. The challenge is extending it to the leaving care population, not just those who by definition are the most settled. And as you've mentioned, Kenny, in your article, that does require a cultural shift on age, information, training, managerial support, and of course funding. It has to be a commitment to the funding of that for it to happen. So the final bits. When we leave care, why should they stop caring? We know that being supported into adulthood is a very important part of parenting. And I think that the services that are developed have made a major contribution to the lives of young people. Services around preparation, housing, finance, careers, health, personal support, and also, which I haven't had a chance to go into because it's a subject in its own right though, the access to services, specific groups of care leavers. There's a danger that we think care leavers is a homogeneous group, and I may have given that unintentionally, not my impression, but there's different groups within the care leaving population. And where you develop services, you have an opportunity to develop specific services around disability, mental health, for young parents, overrepresented group in care, black, minority and ethnic young people, meeting those needs, refugee and asylum young people, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgendered young people. There are issues around those areas of care and leaving care that development of specific services can help a lot with. But there's two aspects of support, and the second is informal support by family friendship networks. And I think one of the difficulties around this is that where we've got the evidence, where young people return to their birth parents, and many choose to vote with their feet and return, then they often return to very negative situations that haven't changed much since their reason for them becoming looked after. In fact, they become more exploitative often when young people get older. And a study by a colleague of mine, Ian Sinclair, clearly showed that those young people often went back. They dropped out of education later, even though they were on a course. Sometimes their mental health suffered. And these are quite old. These are emerging adults. Adulthood we're talking about here, not 10, 11-year-olds, we're about older young people. So I think it's very important to distinguish between positive and negative social capital and have a way of doing it. And I think one way is to extend the family group conference system, which is used in child protection, to get out of that side and think, is this a method that could be used to identify positive networks, informal networks in young people's lives when they become looked after, and build up that resource whilst they're looked after for leaving care. And it could well be, the positive networks could be grandparents, uncles, friends from positive backgrounds, but things that can work rather than just leave it unchallenged, so they return to birth family relationships, which can be very problematic. So I think the family group conference system has a lot of potential with emerging adulthood, with teenagers, not just child protection. And I think it's a thing that should be developed. And having that key person to provide ongoing support. So having a key person to provide support. The last couple of slides. So how do we make corporate parenting happen? A strong legal and policy framework, and Scotland's obviously moved in that direction, which is great. That's enabling. The implementation, this is where you need a strong framework all the time, but the implementation with massive challenges. You need the funding for central and local services and responding to those continuum. You need clear policies for providing those areas I've talked about. I like the things in the Covenant about entitlements and care proofing. I think that's great. Well done. I mean, well done to you. I think you deserve a clap for those. I think they're really important developments and something that we need to explore further. The agenda is massive though for corporate parents because it means, corporate parents aren't social work parents, they're just part of it. It's addressing structural inequalities, so we're talking about the pre-care inequities. Austerity measures, all those areas play a part, maltreatment and neglect, providing high quality placements, positive well-being, and personal support from care. I won't go, there's a little bit I've got here on human agency, how you maximise the involvement of young people in their lives. And I think that's associated generally with the intersectionality between those four areas, stability, education, leaving care, later and support, and the opportunities provided within departments for participation both in your individual lives and within the care system. Pledges, councils, care proofing, there's another area, care proofing policies, involving young people in all those ways is massively important and can enhance their enhanced well-being and feelings of success. If you want to know more about care leavers, why don't you just ask? Very elegant, fashionable, social worker. Right, and that is about agency. Will this slide, are these in the pack, these? No, this will go on the, yeah. So the last slide this is. So care is giving great opportunities to home my parents that care. So one way of keeping corporate parenting human, because it's not a grounded concept, when you're asking people what corporate parent was, and the answers they came up with, things like a nosy parent or a business parent or things like that. So it's possibly, you could think about it as promoting the resilience of young people. And it would require an ecological perspective, not just changing individual odds, but overcoming the odds, so we have a broader contextual approach. It's about responding to the doing well and contextual factors. It's about recognising the agency and individual qualities of young people and their response to adversity. And it's most of all about loving relationships and finding the ordinary magic in young people. And all young people have ordinary magic. That's the wonderful thing about the work you do. If you can find the ordinary magic in your person, whatever that is, then you're a long way on getting them on the road to doing well in adulthood. Thank you very much.